of the program is the way to go. I invite you to join me as we explore places to go and things to do. We're going to explore a place that I had never been before, and I'm sure that you've probably not been before, and that's behind the scenes at the making of a musical. My guest today is the author of a wonderful book called Making It Big. She's Barbara Isenberg, and the story of how this book got to be written and what she learned about the theater is one that fascinated me, and I'm sure is going to fascinate you. So you spent years and years, Barbara, behind the scenes, watching the anguish, watching the joy of what makes this Broadway show big happen. Has it changed your perception of the theater at all?
It certainly has. I can't watch a musical now without thinking about all the anguish everybody went into in terms of doing it. And, I mean, actually, that's one of the things that prompted me to write the book. I had been a reporter for the Los Angeles Times for nearly 20 years, covering musical theater. And I covered little chunks of it, like sometimes I'd write about the auditions or sometimes I'd write about the rehearsals, but I'd never really followed a show all the way through. And I really wondered about how it was done and why were people still doing it, given the fact that so many don't succeed. That's
the point that I say. Now, as I read this book, I felt, because you've done it so well, I felt the pain of the people involved, not knowing whether or not it would be a success. And as those who follow the theater know, Big was an enormously successful show, which was not a success. It had everything. It had great people doing it, everybody behind the scenes. Everything was great about it, and yet it failed. It lost a lot of money. There's a lot of pain in that. And why do people in the theater, why people in their right minds, talented people, why do they go into it? Why do they stay in it?
Yeah, that's something I wanted to know, too. That's why I was going to tell you that I tried to find a show where I knew a couple of the people, and I thought that I could have access. And I had written profiles of 3 of the people on this show, the director, Mike Ockrent, the choreographer, Susan Stroman, and the set designer, Robin Wagner. So they all kind of knew me. And I sent a fax to Mike Ockrent, the director, and it was 2 lines long. It said, "Dear Mike Ockrent, I understand that you're going to direct a musical based on the hit movie Big. Yes. I have an interesting idea for you. Please call me." And he did, 2 hours later. But then they essentially auditioned me. I had a meeting when they came to Los Angeles, which is where I live most of the time. They came to Los Angeles, and they were auditioning people for the show, and they auditioned me. And there were the director, the choreographer, the lyricist and composer, the lyricist Richard Maltby, the composer David Shire.
It was a casting call.
The casting call, right. The music director Paul Gemignani, Ockrent and Stroman, and John Weidman, the book writer. And so we were in this empty theater. I remember all the actors were still waiting. They had done a lot of actors, and it was my turn during the lunch break. And I had to go into the theater, and they were all standing there like this, leaning against the stage, and I was out in the auditorium. And they fired questions at me. Why did I want to do this? Would I be in the way? Why in the world should they do it? And they told me if any one person didn't want to do it, that they wouldn't do it at all.
In their group?
In their group. They'd have a vote after I left. So I gave it my best shot, and I left.
Now, so there's the question now. If you knew then what you know now, would you have done this book?
Oh, of course. I mean, the way I looked at it...
But I feel your pain throughout this book.
Well, see, I decided in the beginning that this was a good yarn. It was people at the top of their craft. It was an extremely well-known movie that was being made into a musical. At that time, there were a lot of movies that were being made into musicals. Some worked, some didn't. You had Carrie and you had Sunset Boulevard.
Yes.
And you had Beauty and the Beast. And so it struck me this was a really good yarn, no matter what the outcome. And so, fortunately, the publisher and I thought that it would be a hit, and the publisher particularly thought it would be a hit. And so we both took a risk. Just like the producers did it.
A question that runs through my mind as I read the book is, were you writing this as you went along, or Big? Maybe we ought to say what happened to Big. What happened to Big? It was expected to be a tremendous success.
Right. The show was capitalized at more than $10 million, which made it a very expensive show. And it got an enormous amount of attention as it went toward its Broadway opening because of the popularity of the film, which is still a popular film.
Yes.
And it had an out-of-town tryout in Detroit. And so the anticipation kept building. And in fact, during the tryout in Detroit, to answer your question, I was there for about a month. And I was in this hotel room, and the rehearsals were usually from noon until midnight. And so I would spend the mornings in my room jotting down stuff from the night before, because I'd usually be too tired by the time I got in. And I remember I had to sit on 2 phone books and put both pillows from the bed behind me to be comfortable to sit there and type. And then I would type in the morning, then I would go to the rehearsal, take notes, and then at first I used to go back to the hotel so I wouldn't have to see the show every evening, and there was no need. It was a good time for me to be writing. But one night, part of the set collapsed, and so as soon as I heard that had happened, from that moment, I raced over to the theater, and it was about a 8-minute walk back to the theater. So from that point on, I would sit and I would work, but I would either work in the hall near the auditorium or in the production
You wanted to be where the action is.
Right, so I could be there. And you could hear the show on the loudspeaker while I was working.
Now, but what happened actually to Big? It was expected to be a smash hit. A lot of money went into it.
Oh, right, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The show went from Detroit. After Detroit, it went back to New York. And there were more rehearsals before it opened on Broadway. And approximately a third of the score was changed for Broadway. And they redid it. When they were in Detroit, they did not have a good ending for the first act. They did not have a song. They didn't have a song for the end of the first act. And a lot of the lines changed. A great deal of the show changed. But by the time they got to Broadway, really, Broadway had changed more than the show had. All of a sudden, Big was not good. Big in the sense of Big was a small B.
Yes, not Big the show.
Because when they started out, the hit shows were Miss Saigon, Les Miserables, Phantom of the Opera. There were Descending Chandeliers, Ascending Helicopters.
And along came Rent.
Right. But by the time they actually opened on Broadway, the emphasis was on small. And you had shows like Rent, you had Bring Into Noise, and suddenly they were in a whole different arena. And they were old-fashioned. Suddenly they were old-fashioned.
And then it opened, and it got mixed reviews.
It opened, well, the New York Times gave it a rave.
Yes.
And
but then the Tonys.
Then came the Tonys. It did not get a Best Musical nomination. So it played for 6 months, and it closed in that last October.
As a flop because
as a financial flop.
I loved it. I saw it and I loved it. And having seen the show before I read the book, I couldn't understand a lot of things that you were writing about because I loved it. And to see the anguish, that brings up another question. We've had in recent weeks, we have a lot of shows, new musicals that opened on Broadway that expected to be tremendous successes, and yet the reviews are not coming in that well. Why do people put so much of themselves into something and not be able to come up with a smash hit? And, you can have one reviewer in the Times give it a rave. The same day, the reviewer in the Gannett newspapers hates it. And then the other way, something I heard on TV when Jekyll and Hyde opened, the reviewer on Channel 2 here hated it. And he said, I'm sure there's going to be some people out there who are going to love it. And the anchor woman said, I loved it, right there in the same show. Yeah. It's cruel, isn't it? Should we get into the subject of critics?
Well, I'm going to answer your first question first.
I can't remember what that was.
Fortunately, fortunately, I remember the notion of why do people do it? Do they? Everybody thinks they're going to have a success. Why would you start any business unless you thought it was going to be successful? And why would you put $10 million into a show unless you thought that it was going to be a big hit? So everybody kind of goes into it with the expectation that they're going to have a good show.
Yes.
And on the other hand, Rocco Landesman, who is one of the major producers on Broadway at Jew Jamson, said he's also a horse racer. And he said once that he thought the odds for shows and horses were about the same. About 15% made it.
Yes.
They were successful. And, you take the risk, but you give it everything you have. And that's what I was trying to show in the book, is how
sure
they
do.
gave it everything they had.
You sure do. So the subject of critics, which was the second part of that question. Critics have a lot of power, don't they?
Oh, I can give you a great example on power. As you know, the critics go to previews, which are held before opening night of
Most
shows.
people don't know that, by the way.
That's why I put it in the book. Yeah.
They used to go opening night, and then they had to rush back and write it by deadline, and then they started to go beforehand, so they had the time to write something. Is that correct? Is that why it's happened that way?
Right. Well, I mean, in London, they still have some critics who have to go home and write. Because I remember going to a theater with a British critic in London, and at the end of the show, he said, "See you," and he just was gone because he had like an hour and a half to write. I think what's happened is that as the deadlines for newspapers have gotten earlier and earlier, they couldn't do it. They couldn't do overnight. Anyway, so reviewers go a few nights in advance. And on Big, the night before Vincent Canby, or the night before the New York Times critic was coming, Mike Ockrent, the director of Big, sat in the seat that he knew Vincent Canby would be sitting in the next night, so he could watch the show from that seat.
Yes.
And then on opening night, which... at this point, obviously the presses are rolling, and I couldn't find Mike Ockrent during the performance on opening night. Toward the intermission, I thought, well, where in the world could he be? So I went searching for him, and I found him out in Schubert Alley behind the theater, because the Schubert Theater is directly across the street from the New York Times. And it was that strange juxtaposition of seeing the show is on stage, but across the street, the presses are rolling with the review. And he kept looking at he kept looking at over there and saying, they're writing it right now. It's coming off that, those presses. Well, I guess presses don't roll anymore because of the computer, but were they to roll, that's what they'd be doing.
Is it a lot of power?
The critics do have power, yes.
Do they appreciate the power that they have, and does it color what they're doing?
Well, every critic is different, like every person is different. I think that in most major American cities, there's one newspaper that has the most power. And but USA Today has a lot of power.
Yes.
And on Big, for instance, USA Today, which has a national audience, and the New York Times both gave it really good reviews. And the USA Today review is important because after a show has been on Broadway for a few months, what happens is that most of the audience is out-of-towners. So they're going to be people who will have seen the
Right, yes. I do want to remind our audience at this point that what we're talking about today is a wonderful book called Making It Big. And my guest today is Barbara Isenberg, who is the author of this great behind-the-scenes book about the making of a musical, and it's just great to read, and it's great to have you here. I'm glad you came in from California to talk with us today. So let's go back to the making of Making It Big. Okay. So you knew the people, and you were auditioned, and then you lived their life, I suppose. Did you devote yourself entirely to spending the time with them?
Well, I want to go back a little bit too, because when I first met with them, and they told, and the principal 6 people who were involved, the choreographer, the director, the book writer, the composer, the lyricist, they got to vote whether or not I should participate.
Oh, I assume the answer was yes.
No, that's what I was starting to tell you. Is the answer? The answer was no, because one person didn't want it, and so I went back the next day. They gave me a second shot, and I told them, that I would not be in their way. I wanted full access, and then I told them, I said, wouldn't it have been wonderful if someone had been there for the making of West Side Story, or Guys and Dolls, or Carousel? And I think that's kind of, I haven't never asked them, but I think that's kind of was what swayed them, because at the end of that discussion, they gave me the access.
And when you say you spent all this time to the exclusion of anything else, you weren't doing any of your other writing during this time?
I was still writing. I'd been writing for the Los Angeles Times for so many years, and during the first year of my work on the book, I continued writing for the LA Times as a freelancer. I came here to interview, I was in New York so much. Like I interviewed Kander and Ebb when Kiss of a Spider Woman was going to Los Angeles. I did a profile of Mandy Patinkin, and I also cover music and art. So
What happened when you saw all the things that were going on? Did it change what your plan was for the book? When you saw the things that were going wrong, you mentioned the fact that so much rewriting was done. Detroit was a terrible problem for them. They changed so many things. Did it change? Did you say, I have to change this book? I have to change its direction?
Because I never knew what was going to happen. This is what people forget is how long it takes to publish a book. You know, you don't finish a book on Monday and have it be published on Tuesday. So the book was finished in July. Now, in July, the show was still selling. You know, I mean, they were having some problems, but I don't think that at that point they were definitely going to close. I mean, I think that they were not having the success that they had hoped for, but they would have some success, and they had so many problems in terms of the show was so expensive to run. You know, when you have a show that's very expensive to mount, often it's going to be very expensive to run.
What do you mean by run? That's a term that I don't know.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
For example, Sunset Boulevard, or a show that's very complicated technically, will have very high running costs, meaning the operating costs. Therefore, once the show is already on stage, you're going to have huge numbers of people backstage. You're going to have electronic equipment. You're going to have all sorts of computer-generated sorts of things. You're going to have advertising costs. You're going to have the cost of keeping the theater lights on. You're going to have health and benefits and welfare for all your actors, for your musicians, for your costume people, your dressers. I mean, it's like running a small company.
Yes. Or nation.
A nation, yeah, right. A very small nation or a moderate-sized company. And so these are all the costs of running a show. And I think that their operating costs were $380,000. That they had $380,000 had to be met before they could start making any money. That's a lot of money. I mean, I think that was one of the problems with Sunset Boulevard, or with many shows. You can only go so long if you're not making any money.
Now, you indicated that you've been covering the arts for a long, long time. Did it change your perspective at all? Did you learn something about it that has changed you forever?
It did, actually. I mean, I now know how hard it is. I mean, I really had no idea. I mean, I knew that it was difficult. I knew that people worked very hard. But because I was so close to it, like sometimes Maltby and Shire would be working on a song, and I'd be sitting on the sofa. I'd be almost, I wouldn't be as close as I am to you, but I'd be double as far as I am from you. They would be working, and I'd be watching how hard it was. Or I would watch them going over the same scene many, many times, changing a word, a line, a phrase. Or they would have these long sessions, 6-hour sessions, where lunch was brought in, and they would sit and they would discuss like one point or one scene or one song for 6 hours. And I remember there was one time when I sat there and listened to them talk about something again and again. And at one point, John Weidman, the book writer, said, you know, this is a discussion we've been having since we started.
Does it all become a blur to them, having done it over and over and over again? Some filmmaker said that after a while, you just can't see it anymore. You just can't see the individual pieces. It's because you've done it so many times and over and over and over again. Does that happen in the theater, too? Do they lose a sense of what's going on?
I don't think the actor's worried about it. I remember one actor telling me, and I believe I quote him in the book, saying how he was always worried that although he had now learned the rewrite of the rewrite, what about the actor across the room, if he can remember which rewrite they were on? But it would be like if you and I were to have this discussion for the next, let's say we started this discussion over right now, and then another half hour from now we started it over. We did it over and over and over. The problem is that there'll be parts you'll like from the first version and parts you'll like from the second version, and you have to have all the continuity and all the threading to make it all work. So that if you pull out like a line or you pull out a song, everything has to be rewritten around it. So it's a continual fabric that you're weaving again and again.
Now, in reading the book, it's almost all pleasure for me, the reader. That's because I'm interested in the theater. Was it all pleasure for you?
To watch it?
No, to do it.
To write it? Well, writing a book is very, very difficult. So,
any more difficult than any other writing?
Oh, sure.
Why is that?
Well, on this one, first of all, I had some time pressure, and because you wanted to get it out as close to the opening as possible. And it's all I did. After I had been in New York a good deal of a time writing this and then being in Detroit and stuff. And all of a sudden I was locked in a room for a few weeks. And I remember telling friends that if I had been kidnapped by terrorists, my lifestyle would have been exactly the same. Because I just wrote all the time.
This brings us back to where I was before. Were you writing the book during the time that you were spending with them? And then you went back and rewrote the book?
And edited. I edited and also, first of all, I tend to write the way many movie makers make movies. I write like twice the length, 3 times the length. I believe the book was 3 times this length at one point. So I had to go back and hone. Because for me, the art is always under a great big shell, and you have to keep scraping away the shell until you get to what's there. And so it's probably a ridiculous way to work.
2 things that I found very interesting in the book. One of them is it's illustrated. You've got some wonderful photos that were taken during the production. And also, almost completely throughout the book, there's a sense of time.
Right. That was intentional.
And time. You knew that from the beginning?
Well, I think when the book started, I did it, I went through a couple years are summarized in a page or 2. But then when things started moving, like at 2:12, if suddenly like steam starts pouring off the stage and the conductor can't see his score, and at 2:17 they turn it off, that's interesting. I didn't actually start watching on my watch as much until toward the end.
Then you realized how essential that was to give a feeling of what was going on.
Of the urgency, of both the urgency, and I think that the intimacy comes for the reader in seeing the time as the person being involved in it sees it.
You get very, very involved in this book. As I said, it's the kind of book that when you finished, you want to start all over again because you feel as if you missed a lot.
Thank you.
I mean, to me, there's 2 ways to read, and one way is to just read it right through, and the other way is to read it and savor each bit and say, hey, this is delicious, and I'm going to reread that paragraph again because it says so much. The narrative is so strong, and you want to know what's going to happen, even though I knew what the ending was, that I missed a lot. And that's why I've gone through it a couple of times, but I want to reread it from the beginning so that I can now enjoy it without having to think about that. I mean, that's what this book does for you. It does for me, at least.
That was my intention. I wanted to write it kind of like a thriller, so in the sense that you couldn't wait to get to the next step. Maybe thriller is the wrong word, but I wanted to have that kind of a hook so that you'd keep going, and you would feel the kind of anticipation and the kind of worry and the kind of hope and dreams that a lot of the people involved with that show did.
And one of the things that I found interesting was the FAO Schwartz involvement. They were obviously involved, and yet there's a strong feeling that I get in the book that a lot of people criticized the commercialism of having that, even though it really didn't exist to the extent that people thought it did.
Well, I think it didn't exist in the beginning. The FAO Schwartz came in after the show was being developed. I think they were a consultant probably in the beginning.
Well, the merchandising, of course, was very important.
Well, the merchandising came toward the end.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Not toward the end, but after it already had begun development. And, it was obviously, the merchandising was a part once it started moving toward Detroit and everything. But the video of the film Big had always been one of their biggest sellers, and as you know, one of the key scenes in the film and in the musical took place at FAO Schwartz. So there was an entire scene that was based on FAO Schwartz, and so they used real props and things. And
then, of course, the piano, the dancing.
That's what I mean. Yeah, the one dance, which is done on a giant keyboard on the floor in FAO Schwartz, was in the film, and then it again was in the musical.
Now, to me, it was a great number. Tremendous number, and yet it had a lot of problems in doing it. It had a lot of problems because they didn't know where to put it.
Well, the problem was, how do you dance on a piano? And how do you dance around a piano? I think that was the problem. The other thing is, you have to remember the difference in the 2 mediums. In the movie, that scene was 2 minutes long, and you had great overhead shots of them dancing on the piano and everything. Whereas on stage, it was 10 minutes, and you didn't have that overhead shot. There were so many things. Another example of the problems of working on stage versus film would be the story is about a boy who wants to be big, who goes to sleep. he makes an idle wish to be big, goes to sleep, wakes up, he's Tom Hanks. So he's big. So at the end of the movie, and getting him back to being small again is a quick shot. It's a cut.
Yes.
Whereas on stage, it was a technological nightmare. The show that wound up on Broadway had 2 actors changing in darkness from an adult to a child. But in Detroit, they had this contraption this kid had to wear, which included his standing on stilts, holding a little thing in his hand, the push button, had a wire up his arm, piston on his back.
And they shrunk him down?
That's how they shrunk him down.
But that didn't make it to Broadway.
No, because the thing had to work precisely. It had to work on the second, and it had to work in a given number of seconds. Because if it was too long, obviously the audience is sitting there waiting for this whole process to take place. If it's too fast, it isn't believable. So they had so many problems with it. I remember sitting behind the magic consultant at one of the performances, the person who had kind of put all this together, a man named Charles Reynolds, and I was just watching him. He was sitting further and further toward the stage and away from the back of his chair as the moment came when the little boy had to push the little buzzer.
And I know there was also an idea of whether they should change, and the heads would hit on the bed. And so many problems in that. It's incredible about how you captured all of this, and as you talk about it, how I remember covering this, and you didn't miss anything in this, and in giving the feeling of what it is. I just do want to remind our viewers that we're talking about Making It Big, the Diary of a Musical. And I thank you so much for coming in from California and talking to us about this. And I've had a wonderful time in reading the book. I urge people to read the book, and I thank you very much for coming here. My guest today has been Barbara Isenberg, who is the author of Making It Big, the Diary of the Broadway Musical Big. Read this book if you love the theater. Read this book, and you will love the theater. I'm Norman Liss. The name of the program is The Way to Go. And until next time, enjoy yourself.